Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me again today for another Bible study, or maybe this is your first time. Thanks for joining me in the first place. We are talking about Job chapter 23 today, and we have our PDF, which we have every day and for every chapter of the Bible, at least that we've covered so far. You can download that for free on our website at tobelikechrist.com if you would like. Let's start off with our first page, which has been mostly the same throughout this Job study. There's, first of all, the short outline of the book of Job. We are in chapters 3 through 37, where Job and his friends are discussing the reason for his sufferings. I do want to make an extra comment about this today that I needed reminded of. You know, when we study Job, because a lot of times we study it over a long period of time, like this study is probably going to take us 60 days or something, or sometimes the book of Job is studied in like a Bible class. So maybe it's only on Sundays or Wednesdays, covering one or just a few chapters a week, and it spans over multiple months. I think we sometimes have the tendency to think that this dialogue between Job and his friends happened over a long span of time. Like maybe one guy speaks and then maybe it's a couple hours later somebody will respond, and then a day later the next guy will speak, and that Job and his friends were talking for days on end and having this discussion. But we actually aren't told how long it took for this discussion to play out. And that's really interesting because it could have been that they had this discussion in like just a couple of hours. You think this is a dialogue, so Job and his friends could have just been sitting and each one going back and forth saying these different things, and it would take about as long to speak as it would take you to listen to the book of Job on like an audiobook, which would be like maybe 2 hours, something like that. And I just think that's important to keep in mind because it could have been a pretty quick conversation, and maybe that accounts for some of the repetitions that we see in the dialogue and why they kind of repeat the same things over and over again, as if maybe they hadn't heard the first time. That would be a little stranger if it was a stretched out dialogue over multiple days or even weeks, but maybe it would make a little bit more sense if it was a very condensed, short dialogue. So we don't know exactly, and I just thought I would point that out as you try to kind of put the book of Job together in your mind and kind of play the story out in your mind and try to understand what's happening here. Okay, so take a look at the other sections in our short outline. Our characters today are going to remain the same. We've got Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad, who have been speaking with him. Today's chapter is a little bit shorter, 17 verses, and I've entitled the verses under the heading, Where Can I Find God? Job speaking here. Job longed to find God in the sense that he wanted to basically be able to walk up to him and to have a conversation with him about his situation and to figure it all out. He knew that God was real, but he also knew that God was in heaven and not immediately accessible in the way that a man can walk up to another man and have a conversation. You know, when you really want to get something done and maybe you send an email, you make a phone call, but you're not getting a response back from that person. You really want to get something done, you just go find that person, right? And have a conversation with him. That's basically what Job wanted to do. He's like, I've been praying, but I don't feel like I'm getting any answers to those prayers. I really just want to walk up to God, and I know that he would answer me and he would be fair with me. God isn't like a human judge who sits in a physical courtroom with a physical address and holds office hours and you can make an appointment with him. But that's the kind of accessibility that Job wanted. He wasn't afraid of God's answer. He knew that God was going to be fair with him. He says this in verse 7, There an upright man could argue with him, and I would be acquitted forever by my judge. While Job couldn't find God the way that he wanted, he was confident that God knew exactly where he was and that God had a purpose in allowing him to suffer. The text says, quote, But he knows the way that I take. When he tries me, I shall come out as gold. And then in verse 14, For he will complete what he appointed for me, and many such things are in his mind. So Job believed that something good was going to come out of his circumstances. And he resolved himself to hold fast to God's ways and to remain unmovable in his confidence that God was eventually, someday, going to vindicate him. So this is a much more upbeat and hopeful speech, a set of words by Job than what we've seen in some previous chapters. That brings us down into our application that I want to take from the last couple verses of this chapter. In the concluding verses of chapter 23, after expressing his confidence that God was on his side, Job talks about how God made his heart faint and terrified him. And this can be a little bit confusing. How is Job confident that God's on his side, but he's also afraid of him? In Job's expression of this terror of the Lord at the end of the chapter, we see an important harmony in God's nature that all of us need to recognize. God is an ally and he's a comforter, but it would be a mistake to see him as only those things. Some people present God almost as if he's like a teddy bear who just wants to bless people and be friends with everybody and who doesn't pose a threat to anyone. Is God our Father? Does God love us? Yes, absolutely. But he's also an incomprehensible being beyond our wildest imagination and understanding. We don't understand the way that he works. Job's already admitted that. We don't always understand why he does the things that he does. We don't understand a tenth of his immeasurable power. He has revealed himself to us in a sense, but there's still so much that we don't know. I think humility is the key here, and we see it in Job. Though you may be the recipient of God's grace and of his blessings, that does not mean that you comprehend him fully. And so we should stand in awe of him, knowing that there's so much more to him that we can't even fathom. He is our friend and our Father. True. He is an infinite force beyond our understanding. True. And Job was right to recognize the harmony of these two truths when talking about God. When we present God to people in our churches and talk about him in our personal lives, we need to talk about him with this harmony in mind. We love him more than anything else, but we also fear him more than anything else. I used to think that term fear of God was kind of like an archaic old term that, old English, old King James term that maybe wasn't really very useful anymore. But the more I think about fearing God and that he's the only being in the universe that we need to truly fear, the more it makes sense. You think about it, like if you cross a relative, if you get on their bad side, there's ultimately no reason to fear them if you're on God's good side. If you cross a politician or even a king, there's no reason ultimately to fear them as long as you're on God's side. If you cross Satan, who's significantly more powerful than any of us, there's no reason to fear him. He can't do anything to you while God holds you secure. Who's the only being that you need to legitimately fear if you get on his wrong side? God. If you think about it that way, you realize that really the only thing that we need to have a legitimate fear of in the entire universe is being on the wrong side of God. Everything else isn't worth your time to fear if you're all right with the Creator. So that's going to do it for our study in Job chapter 23, and Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow to talk about the next chapter.